Hi, I'm Jennifer Valtos.
And I'm Michael Carlin, and we're with the Center for Compassion, Integrity, and Secular Ethics at Life University. And this video, which is part of our facilitator training program for compassionate integrity training, is going to cover skill 7, or empathic concern, and help you understand how to click through the presentation and facilitate the group. So we start as always with this first slide, which has the series that we're working on and the specific skill that we're working on it. And if you click to the next one, we have the build of all 3 series and an opportunity to discuss the connections between these two and ensure that we have a broad understanding of where we've come from and where we're going. And then we're going to click to the next one where we focus specifically in on empathic concern. And again, this may be a good time to do your check-in on how the practices have been going and whether or not anyone has any questions from previous sessions. And so then you click on the next one. We get into really the main topic of today, which is what do we mean by empathy, or specifically empathic concern. And here, like other opportunities, is a chance for you to just open it up and try to get a sense of what the group thinks, what are their preconceived notions, what is their insights into what empathy is. And then after you've had a good conversation about that, you click again, and we come up with our definition that we use within CIT. And we drill down on that a little bit by going into what we call the 2 channels of empathy, which are, by clicking the next slide, you get into the first channel, which is affective empathy. And the definition of this automatically comes up, so you don't really need to have a definition of what people think we mean by this. It automatically comes up so they understand that this is the channel of that automatic emotional resonance that we have with others, and is a very natural kind of connection with others. And if you want to throw in a little bit of the research or the thinking behind it, is this idea that we have this innate in us, and actually is tied in some ways to things like yawn contagion and things like that, because we mimic other people within our group as a form of protection in some ways. So that, for example, if somebody I'm with all of a sudden starts screaming in fear and runs off, I am going to also feel like I'm scared, I'm fearful, and I'm going to run off following them, even though I have no understanding of what's going on. And we can see how that would be very adaptive, because if that person was looking at me and behind me was a charging rhinoceros or something, and they got scared and ran away and I followed them, then that would be helpful for my survival. Whereas if I looked at them in a puzzled way and didn't understand what was going on and really spent time trying to figure out why they were acting the way they were, then I would be no longer alive. And so that affective resonance is really important for all sorts of different reasons. That's just one example that we have, but where we don't have to necessarily cognitively understand it, which is why we get to the next slide, which is our next form of empathy, or the next channel of empathy, which is what we call cognitive empathy. And here again, the definition will come up. And this is about what we also call perspective taking, or putting ourselves in another person's shoes. And this is the need to understand what's going on with somebody, what is going on in their mind, what is their perspective on things, how do I understand what their experience is, what their thoughts are, what their emotions are, using the cognitive logics that I have, the cognitive processes that I have. And then that may be a way of eliciting some affective empathy with that person. It may not, but it's a way of doing it more in a intellectual way. Sometimes this is called cold empathy versus hot or warm empathy. But both together oftentimes are necessary. If you have one without the other, it can also cause problems. So for example, Oftentimes people will use the idea that a psychopath or a sociopath has excellent cognitive empathy, but very poor affective empathy, because they can completely understand what somebody's thinking, experiencing, and feeling, but they don't actually resonate with those feelings. And so they're very capable of then manipulating those people. And this could be what is oftentimes called the downside of empathy. So there are those two channels which are important to differentiate, because as we move into the practices later, we cultivate these a little bit differently, or we move between them. And cognitive empathy is really critical if we're going to try to understand people that we believe are different than us or in our outgroup. So if you click from there, you'll move into our group activity, and Jennifer's going to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Michael. So then we move to our group activity, and our group activity is the empathy line, which you will find all the specific instructions in our facilitator guide. And we're going to complete the empathy line. And the empathy line is a great activity, and what it actually often will do is it will often help us look at our empathy and find that it is biased. And so if we click on the next slide, when we have that empathy, we have that serious, intense empathy for our in-group, we find that it will often create a bias towards the out-group. And so we need to be very aware that our empathy, I have such serious, intense empathy for this particular group, and it causes me to have a negative reaction and to increase my bias towards another group. And so we really need to be, we want to be aware of that, because what we're trying to do is, of course, decrease our bias, as we recall from previous sessions. We also find that if we click to the next slide, we often feel empathy for one person, sincere, true empathy for one person and individual suffering, which is the first click on this slide. But then what we see is, on the second click on this slide, is that we have less empathy for group suffering. And so when we have that intense empathy for individual suffering, we find that the reverse is true, and that's called compassion fade. And so Michael is going to talk to us a little bit more about that and some of the science and research that goes with that.
Thank you, Jen. And when we click from this slide to the next slide, we get into a little bit of the research that supports this whole idea of how empathy can be biased, it can be irrational, and why cultivating empathy, even though it's a skill that we're born with, why cultivating it in a way that is less biased and increases it across more people is so important. So this is one study. A lot of this work has been done by Paul Slovic, and this particular study was all about what he calls compassion fade. It can also be thought of as empathy fade, if you will, and how affect and charity are greatest for a single child in need, which is obvious maybe if we think about it, because we see this is how a lot of charities or a lot of NGOs raise money, right? The individual child in need, the individual animal in need, that pulls at our heartstrings. And so if you click again, what will happen is a particular quote from that abstract will pop up that kind of underscores the point of this slide, which is our capacity to feel sympathy for people in need appears limited, and this form of compassion fatigue can lead to apathy and inaction, etc. I won't read the whole quote here, but it's something to show up on the screen and talk to people about, ask people if they have experienced this, if they have some examples from their own lives, and it's a really kind of in some ways illogical feature of our innate ability to feel empathy. If you click to the next slide, this is some of the specific graphs from this particular article. Again, it's not necessary for you to be an expert in this research or to pretend to be an expert. This is just a way of briefly going through to show people that there is data and research that supports some of these ideas, and that it's why we actually need to work towards cultivating the opposite, the increase in empathy. And so each time you click, a little red box will appear around one of these particular graphs, and so it just moves through it. And again, you don't have to be an expert in this, but just talk about how it may seem nonsensical that we reduce our empathy from even going from one person to a second person in need. But it's almost imperceptible. But based on this research, you see, going back to up to A, that there is that slight decrease in empathy, and that even the positive feelings, which is in B, go down. The amount of money that we give goes down, and then I'll click here finally to D. The positive affect goes down on this fourth measure. So you see how quickly these things can tail down, even going from 1 to 2 and then 1 to 8. It's even more significant. So that is one significant way our empathy is biased. Another way is that and again, this is from that same report, the actual value of the lives that we would be saving, the value of the person, the value of that child that we would be saving, actually our perception of the value goes down the more the number of children or the number of lives at risk increases. When you click to the next one, you'll see another article that was done after the Syrian crisis and the refugee crisis and the civil war in Syria. And if some of you might remember, there was a really, really tragic picture of a young child, a toddler, who had washed up on the shore. We don't include that picture in this presentation, again, because of its possibility to trigger people. It's a very disturbing image. But you can remind people of that image, and that image really shifted the conversation around the refugee crisis. If you click to the next slide, you'll see that up until the point that picture was taken, almost 250,000 people had already died in the conflict. But yet it was almost not talked about at all. Very little money was going into supporting any kind of support for refugees of that nature and things like that. But yet, when that picture emerged and became kind of ubiquitous on social media, you can see in the next slide how when you look at the Google data, at that point there was a huge spike in Google searches for the word Syria, for the word refugees, and the word Elan, which was the young child's name. You see that spike, but as you can also see, very quickly it faded. From September, already by October, it had faded dramatically again, because that image of that one child was so much more powerful than the 250,000 who had already died leading up until that point. And then again, it fades very quickly. A few more of these graphs in here just show how the spike in funds that were raised for this crisis emerged after that one image. So again, just reinforcing the idea of how our empathy can be quite powerful, but also quite illogical, that we would be more sensitive to the needs of one than we would be to the thousands, even though from a logical perspective, our empathy should be thousands of times greater if we're dealing with thousands of people versus one. And this leads us into the discussion of empathic distress versus empathic concern, which is what Jen will talk about next.
Thank you, Michael. So you'll notice that when you click for the first time on this slide, the image on the left will appear, and that's the image for empathic distress. So we're going to discuss the difference between empathic distress and empathic concern and what those two look like. So empathic distress is not to be confused with real empathy. So empathy is other-focused. When we're focusing on other people, that's true empathy. Empathic distress, we're more focused on ourselves and trying to alleviate our own suffering. And what we're trying not to do is exaggerate the suffering of others. And when we're acting out of empathic distress, this can sometimes happen. Empathic distress will often occur when an individual feels overwhelmed by the suffering or the experience of somebody else, often because we feel powerless to help that individual. And empathic distress can often lead to burnout or stress or fatigue for ourselves. So we need to be very careful when we're acting out of empathic distress. The image to the right, when we click again, shows empathic concern. And you'll notice right away that the visual representation is completely different. And so empathic concern is what we're trying to cultivate. This is the kind of empathy that we want to cultivate. We are focused, when empathic concern, we are focused on the concern for others and versus the concern for ourselves. And empathic concern is often considered a precursor to compassion, which we talk about in the next skill. So an example of empathic distress or empathic concern, I'm taking my daughters to the grocery store and they are standing in the checkout line with me and it's like, Mom, can I have candy? No, we don't need candy right now. We're going home to make dinner. But I want candy. No, we don't need candy. We're going home to make dinner. And of course, they start throwing a temper tantrum. Not that they would, because, my children are angels. But if they start throwing a temper tantrum, eventually I give in and I say, okay, fine, you can have the candy. I'm acting out of distress. I'm trying to alleviate my own suffering. I'm not trying to help them. I'm trying to alleviate my own suffering. And so I give in, but it's really not what is best for the girls at that particular time. So we often get the question of how do we deal with empathic distress? And one of the reasons that we focus Series 1 on cultivating ourselves is to be able to deal with just these things. So the skills that we learn in the first series and being able to take care of ourselves, especially by the first thing we do, grounding and resourcing and tracking, those skills will be very useful for us as we continue to move through the program, but especially dealing with empathic distress. So then we can move to our reflective writing activities and our mindful dialogues, which give us an opportunity to reflect and have conversation with our partners. And then we can move into our final topic for the day, which is sympathetic joy. Sympathetic joy, also known as sympathonia. And that is feeling empathy for another person's joy or happiness. And so when somebody comes and tells me that they have just been promoted at work and they are thrilled, my hopefully automatic response would be to be thrilled and ecstatic with them, to truly appreciate and understand and empathize with them and experience that joy firsthand with that individual. So we want to be able to understand and express that happiness and that joy with them at the same time. And then we are going to move into our contemplative practice, which Michael's going to talk about.
Thank you, Jennifer. And the contemplative practice that we typically do in a session, because it falls right on the heels of talking about sympathetic joy, is the sympathetic joy practice. And as we do this practice, it's really important to underscore the fact of how difficult sympathetic joy can be. Even though maybe on first blush it's like, oh, I can be happy for another person. That's easy. The reality is, and particularly when somebody achieves something that you really want, like Jen said, a job promotion, or they receive money, or they, whatever it might be, their children achieve something, that can create jealousy and even some resentment in us. And that's really, this practice is all about trying to imagine that and trying to figure out what is more beneficial for us, that resentment and jealousy or sympathetic joy, which, again, getting back to the idea that we all really want happiness and an alleviation of difficulty and suffering, and I have a lot of control over my thoughts if I choose to, then which way would I want to go? Would I want to go in feeling joy with that person or feeling resentment and jealousy? You can also, if you want, revert to one of the other practices here on empathic concern itself, which would not be around sympathetic joy. And then once you've done this practice and you've done some debrief, you click on the next slide. And again, that brings us to the conclusion of the session and the conclusion of empathic concern as part of the Relating to Others series and to the end of this training video. So we look forward to seeing you for the next one. Thanks.